Hi, everyone, and welcome to another K6 Office Hours. As always, I'm Nicole van der Hoeven, and today I'm joined by Lee Barnes. You
Hello,
want to
everyone.
introduce
Thanks,
yourself?
Nicole, for having me. Yep, absolutely. So I'm Lee Barnes, CTO of Utopia Solutions. Utopia Solutions is a software quality and testing firm. I personally do a lot of work in performance testing and test automation, mostly in an advisory role, um, helping organizations understand how they can best implement those disciplines within their delivery processes.
So, how long has Utopia Solutions been around?
Oh, Utopia Solutions has been around for about 21 years now, so a long time. I first got started in this space going back even longer than that, probably 93, 94. Shortly after that, um, we became, if anyone remembers, Mercury Interactive's first partner, uh, one of the first partners, if not the first, back in 1995. So
Wow,
long, long, long history with this stuff, for better or worse, I guess.
that's huge. And have you always done performance testing in particular, or is it testing in general?
Testing in general, testing in general. I even performance testing and automation. I approach primarily from a process centric perspective. You know, back in the early days, it was load runner. Even before I think it was called Load Runner, Mercury had some tool on a Unix platform that we were using to do load testing with concurrent X window sessions, something crazy like that. Um,
Mm,
so certainly back in the day, folk more tool centric because there wasn't that many tools, but I always had an interest in understanding, well, what's the right way to do this? What's the right way to approach performance testing? And I think we should probably say, before we get started, there's a lot of terms thrown around, I think, generically for performance testing and load testing. Um, uh, I this is general, multi-user testing, or whatever the specific goal is, right? I think we can have specific terms for that, but I typically use performance testing more generically, which I think probably a lot of purists don't like, but it um, uh, pretty well accepted, I think.
yeah, I think it also has evolved as the industry has evolved because before it was just performance testing was just the one thing. Performance testing was exactly the same
Right.
as load testing or backend testing, because that's all that existed. But now it's certainly gotten more nuanced. So now I think performance testing can include front end testing, like those browser based or browser driven
Yep.
tools
Yep.
that measure like elements on the page, not just the response time from a client to a server and back.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think too, the important thing when you get started is to understand what the objectives are. If you call something a general performance test and don't really know what you're after, well, that's a big issue. But if you understand what your objectives are, what you call it is less important, probably.
Yeah. And I also might be, sometimes I'm tempted to add in the definition of performance things like reliability or availability or scalability. I guess it's just a matter of semantics in the end because different people say it's a different area, like maybe it's on the same level as performance. But just for me, in order to say that an application performs, isn't it important that it's available or scalable?
Oh,
And I
absolutely.
think it's all very interrelated.
It is all very interrelated, and I think a lot of organizations get in trouble because they don't understand that, right? They throw some concurrent load at a system. Maybe they've thought about it a little bit in terms of how that might map to what they expect to see in production. But there's not a whole lot of thought, right? Everything's very compartmentalized,
Mm.
and they check the box in terms of the testing, but they're not thinking about that broader question of, oh yeah, it performed in this test environment, but is it even going to be available in production to perform?
And I don't remember if we talked about this the first time we spoke, but I also wanted to bring up the normal delineation between functional testing and non-functional testing because I just hate the term non-functional.
Oh,
It
terrible,
is,
terrible.
yeah, it seems like it's not necessary if it's not functional.
Yeah, exactly. And I sort of get where it came from, right? Functional testing, um, has its definition, and what performance or load or stress testing is different from that. So, maybe that was just uh, intuitive to maybe call it non-functional testing, but I don't like the connotation it has. And I think you're right. If it's non-functional, why are we doing it?
Yeah, I think that as the internet has only grown in reach and more companies, especially during the pandemic, have gone online, we've just gotten to the point where being able to handle higher load than normal or higher load than you expect and doing some sort of load testing to prepare for that is a functional issue.
Oh, absolutely. If it can't handle the load, it can't function. So let's just
Yeah.
drop the delineation between those two things.
So let's talk about how we met. We met because we are both speaking in a conference next month. It's going to
Yep.
be TestCon Europe. And let me actually just post the link to Lee's speaker page at TestCon. Can you tell us a bit about what you're going to be talking about?
Sure. I'll be talking about continuous performance testing, and the 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 purpose of the talk is really to identify that the way that many of us, myself included, have done performance testing for a long, long time just doesn't apply in more modern, iterative, fast-paced delivery processes. I spent years and years of my career helping organizations set up these kind of monolithic performance testing centers of excellence, and tests that were executed at the end of long waterfall release cycles, and that seemed to work. But the reality was, even if we found issues after this long development cycle, it was way too late in the process for the organization to get their first glimpse of how the system performed. Um, so the talk points out the issues associated with that approach. I call it the traditional approach, and talks then goes into talk about, okay, what can we do at each stage of the pipeline to learn something about performance, and spend some time talking about kind of what's missing, right? If you do some research or even just talk to organizations, not a lot of organizations are doing performance related activities upstream in the pipeline. So I thought it was interesting to dig in and try to find out why that is. So we spent some time talking about that as well.
So what do you think is the push towards incorporating performance into DevOps or CI/CD pipelines now?
Well, I think if you try to take a traditional approach to performance testing and move it toward the end of the product development cycle, um, you're losing a lot of the benefits and advantages of delivering in a more modern, iterative, efficient way. Um, and or you're letting your customers performance test it, right, as the system is released over time. Um, uh, but if you push that upstream, you're understanding performance at a much earlier time and a much lower level, where the remediations uh, are obviously much more efficient to make from a cost and a time perspective. We've probably all been involved in situations where we've found some infrastructure architecture related performance issue right before the system's being released, and the choices are not very good at that point. It's either we release and we take our medicine, or we delay release a long time while we try to remediate that.
There are two comments here I wanted to highlight. Naveen Kumar says performance makes an app function.
Absolutely.
Which I totally agree with.
It's part of the function, right? It's an attribute of the functionality.
And James Leatherman also says he would suggest that the old axiom that a defect costs 10x to fix in production versus development is no longer valid and hasn't been for several years. And this is a follow on from that. And that also means that you can take advantage of production workloads to validate and optimize performance.
Oh, absolutely. I think I don't know if I agree 100% with the cost to fix defects that could have been found much earlier that make it into production are not more. But evaluating performance should be a continuum, and from the very beginning of a delivery process all the way out into production, because the reality is there's things that that you can't find in a non-prod or upstream environment.
Mm-hmm. I guess it also depends on the methodology that you're following, because if a company is still following like a waterfall type methodology, then I still think that a defect in production is way more expensive to fix than earlier on. But for some teams that are structured in a more agile way, that are doing continuous builds to production several times a day sometimes, I think that cost has gone down for sure.
Oh, absolutely. The increment of what you're releasing to production is so much smaller. 18 months of work, right? That's just, and now finding a performance issue is a big issue. 18 hours of work is a big difference. So from that standpoint, I agree completely.
It was interesting that you were talking about monoliths, because that's normally a term that's used to describe the application, not the testing tool stack. So I'd never quite thought of it that way, but I totally understand what you're saying, and it makes sense. And on that note as well, it kind of reminded me of Conway's Law, which is often a law that's discussed when talking about monoliths versus microservices. And Conway's Law, for those who don't know, it says that there is a correlation. It's an observation that there's a correlation between the architectural design of the system that you're building and the structure of your team. And I'm thinking that perhaps that's also one reason why testing and performance testing has changed, because teams are now agile. It's not just one gigantic team and everybody's a part of it. There's, smaller teams of testers or developers, or maybe it's broken up into cross-functional teams depending on a feature. And that lends itself more to a kind of performance testing that is more continuous in nature. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The organizations, and even some of them that I've helped set up their performance testing center of excellence, they struggled trying to fit that model, trying to have that be essentially an internal service bureau to all these agile delivery teams. And they didn't see any improvement or really any success at all until they started to move that function into the delivery teams themselves. And get away from that kind of performance test team sitting up in the ivory tower and waiting for code to be delivered.
So why do you think more people or more teams aren't doing it? Why isn't everybody doing performance testing continuously?
Well, I think that it's just not something that people have done because of the traditional model of it's always performance is someone else's problem, right? We're going to give them the application, in whatever state it's in, and they're going to execute that performance test, and they're going to hand the results back. So it's a way of thinking, it's an approach, it's tool sets, it's processes around analysis that the delivery teams just haven't done before. Certainly nothing to do with their capability to do it. It hasn't been part of their work life.
You were saying earlier that you thought that not too long ago, performance testing was very tool centric. Would you say that it's still as tool centric now?
I think it can be. I don't think that's the right approach. I think the biggest value from performance testing is in the analysis. And if you don't design the right test based on the right objectives and build the tests that effectively implement those objectives, the results you get and therefore the analysis is not going to be the right the value that you expected. So I think it's still very important to take a process-centric approach. The tools, though, right? They have to support your objectives. They have to work in your with your technology stack. They have to be available to your to the users, and that's changed a lot over the years as well, right? When we had these dedicated teams, they could go very deep in a tool stack, and as long as that tool supported their technology environment, that worked. But now we've got a much broader set of users as we move performance testing into the delivery teams. Certainly not any less capable technically, but tests that had big learning curves or very specific ways of working or of using them. I've seen some difficulty with those types of tools being pushed into the delivery teams. They need to be a lot more developer friendly.
Yeah. And I think it's funny because this is the K6 office hours, right? So we are a tool builder and vendor. And yet I don't think that K6 is what's going to make you a good performance tester. No tool can make you a good performance tester. It can help you along that path, absolutely. But like you say, if the tool itself doesn't fit in with how you work or how you want to be working, that's one issue. But another issue is if you don't know the fundamentals of performance testing, or you haven't spent the time to understand what it is you're trying to figure out with your tests, then
Yep.
it doesn't matter if the tool is great.
It doesn't, and I think this is true with any tool, right? I see a lot of situations where they pick up a tool and they create some scripts and generate some load, and call that a performance test or a load test or whatever their objectives might be, if they even have any, and that there's really no value in that. In the end, they might get lucky and they might find something, putting a system under load and happen to stumble into something. But in terms of really understanding the performance of the system under various conditions that are important, right? That's like finding a needle in a haystack with that approach.
Yeah. And what are some things, so I guess when you talk about continuous performance, what does that entail?
Well, to me, it's evaluating performance at the appropriate level and to the extent you can at each stage of the pipeline. So in general, as you move further upstream, it's looking at performance at a much smaller componentized level. One of the biggest problems that I see with the traditional approach, or with organizations trying to implement a traditional approach within Sprint, for example, is that they have this, some number of very very brittle, very sensitive scripts, and as the application changes, they can't keep up, right? They can't get that test ready to run. But if you're focused at a much smaller level, there's the scripts, typically there's less impact to individual scripts, especially if those scripts are at an API level versus an HTTP or a UI level. But you're understanding something about the system at a much smaller, much more modular, componentized way. Now, did those results mean anything to a production user? No, probably not. So you're not publishing those results in the same way you'd publish some response time analysis under load in a more production-like test. But you can take those results and trend them over time. And then if you see anomalies in those trends, you can investigate them and be able to trace those issues back to the commit or much more closely to the commit that caused them, again, versus end of cycle type performance testing where, yeah, we've got some problem. Now we got to start digging in and see where it is.
Yeah, so I would also, I think this might be a good time to share something that this is a way that I try to incorporate performance testing continuously. Let me share my screen. So, okay, so I've got a site, and this is just my personal site. This isn't a K6 thing. Please don't load test it, by the way. But I am concerned about I'm about the performance of this little blog that I've got. And one way that I've tried to address that is that I use Hugo. So all of these are my blog posts, right? And right in the same repository that I have my blog posts, I've also got a K6 script. And it's a pretty simple one. It goes to the home page. So it goes to 2 different pages and has think time, right? And
Yep.
how I do that, how I incorporate it is because my blog is on GitHub, I just have an action that fires that test off every time I commit to the repository. So every time I change something on my blog, whether that's, adding a new blog post or changing the theme or adding another page,
Yep.
I get these runs of that same test. And the cool thing is you're talking about trending. This is the same thing on K6 Cloud now, because that's one of the advantages of working for K6 is that I can set up these things on my personal blog and call it work, because it is. I'm seeing how the response times change over time. And because I set thresholds, there are also some times where I can see it turn red now, and
Yep.
and then I can get immediate feedback on what's working, what's not working. And I've got 2 ways that it runs. One is when I actually make a change, and the second way is I schedule it. So see, it says here that the next run is going to be at 4:45. Oh, that was actually, I think I should refresh this because I think it just ran. So the next one's going to be at 8:45 p.m. today. So this is just the last run, slightly higher, but I mean we're talking about 40 milliseconds here.
Yeah.
So I think that that's also kind of what you're talking about, right? That it doesn't have to be. I think that one of the things that hold people back is that they think, oh, if I do performance tests all the time, then that's 1,000 user tests every
No.
hour, every day.
Yep.
This is 5 users. I'm using 5 users for mine, but it's still enough to give me data.
Absolutely. A handful of iterations, a handful of users typically at the component level. And remember, we're likely not going to be in environments that are anything like production upstream, right? So the ability to run large user loads doesn't make a whole lot of sense, anyway. But absolutely, you're learning something about performance. And I think one of the probably the most important point when implementing some type of continuous performance testing is start small and evolve, right? I can't prescribe a one-size-fits-all solution. I don't think there is one. Whatever works in your organization, my talk's going to give some guidelines on how to approach that and how to think about it. But ultimately, you're going to do what works for your organization. And, if a few iterations for a few users isn't enough for some reason, you're not getting the data you want, change it. Or the type of test, whether it's an API call or something more at the UI level, HTTP request, maybe, for whatever reason, you have to pivot one way or the other. But absolutely, you can't think about this old traditional huge load kind of high fidelity performance test in upstream environments.
Yeah. You also, I think that the few user test gives you sometimes even more data than a single 1,000 user test that everybody was prepared for, because if it's just 5 users, you can run it across even your production environment, and it's not going to be noticeable, or if it is, then you have a bigger problem than the load
Yes.
test, right? Or the test.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
But that makes you more flexible too. It gives you more options for where you run it. You can run it in pre-production environments and production if you're okay with it just being a few users, because if those the key thing is that those users have to be running with some regularity, not just
Yep.
once a week, but maybe every day, every hour. Sometimes it depends what your use case is, of course.
Absolutely. And how frequently you're committing or building. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One on the other end of that, one of the biggest problems that I've seen where organizations have tried to implement this is just overwhelming the organization with data. And they didn't start small. They built a bunch of these little tests. Maybe the tests were fine in each independently, but there was so much data coming back to the organization, they didn't know what to do with it, and they haven't seen it
Hmm.
before, right? So you've got to be able to understand the data that you're seeing, and you've got to be able to take action on it if necessary. And one of the symptoms I see in that case is it's just kind of overwhelmed, and they try to keep up, and then it's just like, oh, we're going to ignore it because it's just too much. So one of the things I'll talk about is you've got to start small, right? And learn, understand the data that you're getting, and then ask for more. And maybe the data you started with isn't as valuable as you thought it was going to be. Well, okay, well, let's stop there and let's look somewhere else where we can get some more meaningful data.
Yeah. And it's also important when you're running these tests to have a clear understanding of what is acceptable and what isn't. So thresholds are a really good way to do that. If
Yes.
you can set, an acceptable response time, and then, maybe you can set up notifications so that your team is informed when the performance crosses that threshold, then you're actually making use out of those tests, because otherwise these tests might be running in the background, but if you're not getting that notification when things go wrong, then you're missing out on a lot of the value.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. And it's just as important to set those thresholds so they're not too sensitive as well, because the similar problem happens and you just start ignoring those alerts.
Yeah. So that's the
Absolutely.
problem, though, that sometimes, depending on the tool, sometimes you can't even set thresholds. Sometimes they just run the scenario and then that's it. They don't really give you any insight as to whether or not that was good or bad.
No, true. I think a lot of the organizations that I see that have implemented this successfully maybe aren't relying as much on the tool. They're taking the data and importing it into maybe their own time series database and setting their alerts that way, rather than they're using the tool more um, uh, as the load generator and maybe as the initial collector of data. But they may have multiple tools for multiple reasons, and they try to um, collect that data in a single repository and report out of that, for example.
Yeah, so just before we started broadcasting, we were talking about the importance of observability and the difference between traditional traditional monitoring and observability. And it's that in traditional monitoring, you go and identify what you want to measure, and then you set up ways to measure those metrics in particular. The
Yep.
problem is that sometimes you run a test and something goes wrong, and you didn't measure the things that you now need to look at. So observability is a little bit different because it instruments a lot of things. It sets it up so that many of the things that maybe you didn't even think you would need to look at are now being monitored. And after the test, it's more exploratory. It's not just like check this, okay, done, check that. It's more like, I wonder what this metric was at this particular time, and something having an observability platform set up
Yeah,
is essential to performance testing these days.
I agree 100%. And even you mentioned, look at a specific data point at a specific time. The traditional APM tools, and they may say they have observability, but not true observability. Most of that data is aggregated, so the ability to get down to a very specific data point is lost, right? And where observability, you can ask very specific questions about data with high cardinality and get down to, okay, yeah, this specific user had this specific problem at this specific time, as opposed to hundreds or thousands of data points that are aggregated into a single point.
Yeah, the granularity of the data makes a huge difference, actually. And that's why sometimes when you get a performance testing report and it's all like the average response time across all of these transactions was this, I don't actually find that useful at all because they're different transactions. If you're averaging something, then it means that you're assuming that all of those transactions are comparable, and
Yes.
often they're not.
No. Well, even the same transaction or the same process that you're executing over a period of time, most performance and load tests have a period of ramp up. So you have some data points that were taken with relatively little load on the system, and other data points that were taken with high load. The average doesn't tell you a whole lot. And talking about the approach to performance testing, looking at the 90th or 95th percentile of the data tells you a lot more about the actual response time than something like the min max or the average. But very often that's the data that I see reported. And again, how meaningful and how valuable is it? A lot of people don't understand that maybe there isn't a whole lot of value there.
This comes back to the monolith versus microservice in testing tools conversation, because I think a lot of the tools now are going towards this one-stop shop mentality where they just want everything packaged in a pretty bow from start to finish. And I get that that's, I guess, in some ways easier for users because you only install it once. But for me, I don't know, maybe I have wanderlust in my heart or something, because I do not want to be tied down. I want to be able to say, well, I don't like this results analysis tool. I want to plug in my own. And I hate being locked down because I don't want to get into the situation where I change tools and now all the previous baselines that I took I can't use anymore because, it doesn't present the information in the same way.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And if you talk to a lot of seasoned performance testers, I think you'll find that they're what I call tool smiths. So they understand how to find and use the tool that is most effective for whatever their specific problem is, versus maybe newer performance testers. There's nothing wrong with this, but they tend to become what I call tool jockeys. And so instead of using tools for the appropriate purpose, they grab one tool and they ride it. And they don't really, and there's also a danger in that scenario where they become very tool centric and don't really understand performance testing as an approach or a process, but they look at the tool as the performance test.
Yeah. And I mean, I work at K6 now, but I haven't even been here a year yet. I think it's 9 months so far. And before that, I wasn't using K6. I was using JMeter and Gatling and Selenium and Puppeteer, because I like to try different tools, because if you don't know what's out there, then how do you know that you're using the right one? So I think that's
E-
a very big
Exactly.
danger in performance testing, to get pigeonholed because that's the tool that you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't know what's out there, so how do you know if what you have is providing you the value that you need? Because you really
One
don't
of
know
the
anything else.
One of the things that sold me on K6, because when I wanted to change jobs, I looked at K6 in particular. So it wasn't just happenstance. I liked the tool. And one of the things that I liked is that they cater specifically to developers. I mean, testers can use it too, but most testing tools cater to testers. But K6 has a developer bent, and I thought that the concept of unit tests for performance is something that not many tools have really explored.
No, no, and I don't think many organizations have explored it. As part of my presentation, I did some research. I haven't done a whole lot of, just given my background, a whole lot of unit level performance testing, but there are a suite of frameworks. I won't call them tools, but frameworks out there for supporting performance testing at the unit level, and a lot of problems you wouldn't even think of. For instance, just because the tests are so small, and it's important to be very sensitive in response times. Some of these frameworks have capabilities to kind of package up your tests and your code and put them on a known isolated environment, because whatever else is going on in the environment that you're executing the test could have a huge impact on those results. So yeah, very interesting research there. Although I don't see it a whole lot in practice.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that the language is a big deal as well, because the ideal is a testing tool that uses the same language that you're developing in. But there's so many languages that it's hard to pick one.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those frameworks that I found in my research, they were almost all Java based. I suppose not
The
surprisingly, but
Yeah, well, a lot of load testing tools are Java based too, and I would like to see the industry move a bit away from that, just because Java's a pretty old language now. Is it like 30 years
yeah,
now? And it's starting to show. And I think having used Java based tools in the past, it's really frustrating. One of the things that I hate is that there's this whole JVM layer that you also have to
right.
tune. So you have your
Yeah.
script, you have the application, and then the JVM. You have to know how much memory to allocate to it, and this is just, you're adding a layer of complexity that I would rather not have.
And another important aspect of that is a lot of users don't understand that, right? So they execute performance tests and don't understand that possibly their tool setup are impacting the results that they're seeing.
And it comes back to who's testing the performance testing tools.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Because they need to be tested too. You are going to be relying on this tool to tell you whether your application is performant or not. So you better be sure that it's performant too, because you
Yeah,
don't want it to be the bottleneck.
yeah. You mentioned the K6 being a developer friendly tool, and there was a trend. It's not as bad as it was, but there was a trend in the commercial tools, especially around ease of use. And the idea was I need someone to be able to create scripts as fast as possible and be able to play them back and have that green check mark. Um, because there was this feeling that the scripting was just too complex, too difficult. Um, but what that resulted in was very often um, just kind of hiding what you really needed to understand about what you were doing from the users, and opening up um, to a set of users that, of course, had good intentions, but just didn't really have the foundational knowledge to understand what they were doing. Yes, they could get a script to work, but those ease of use features marketed by those commercial tools for a long time, I felt anyway, caused more problems than they solved. Um, just by allowing people to check the box on, yes, I created a set of scripts, I ran a test, with really no thought beyond that, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think that it's very telling that at K6 we are almost, I think almost all of us are engineers of some sort. And we use K6. And so we care about it being slow or being clunky. We've made decisions against, we've decided not to include certain features just because it would make K6 bloated. So we make a lot of interesting design decisions as a team that I think maybe if you were purely watching out for from a profit perspective, that it might make more sense to include features, all the features, so you can say yes to everyone who wants that feature. But the reality is you still, those things come at a cost. You still have to pay in overhead every time
Yep.
that you add something to a tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And the number of use cases that require millions of concurrent users maybe are not as high, but as those tools become more bloated, their ability to support those use cases becomes very, very difficult. We had a project just this last year where um, a good handful of tools really couldn't get anywhere near the generating the level of load. Yes, they were cloud-based load generation, and uh, but the infrastructure and the bloat, as you described, just those tools started kind of rattling around, you know, in the hundreds of thousands of users, and really had no hope of getting to where we needed them to get. So there's a trade-off for sure.
So so what did, I can't remember if you told me this earlier, but what did they end up going with?
Well, the customer changed their objectives, unfortunately, and uh, didn't get to the concurrency, or the throughput volume that they wanted to, which was a problem, right? Uh, they had purchased a tool, a subscription, and um, didn't make the tool vendor prove that they could do what they said they could, unfortunately. So
Okay, well, I do want to show this blog post. Take it with a grain of salt. This is made by K6, so just understand that. But I think it's actually a very unbiased, if that's possible, review. It's very thorough. This is a blog post that compares different tools, and you know it's unbiased because K6 isn't the best for everything. It's not the best performer or whatever. So this definitely includes areas that we could improve in. Just put that link in the chat as well. But
awesome.
what I love is that it has like the memory usage here, and it goes through all of the tools. And like I said, K6 isn't isn't the best in this regard, right? Because this Apache bench is still better in terms of the memory usage, and also the RPS. But it kind of gives you a more quantitative way to assess tools, right? To see
Yep.
whether or not you can adopt these tools.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So it's like a bit of a trade-off. And by the way, I think the scripts or the tests that were done are also linked to here, so you can see, you can try it yourself.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, so these are all reproducible tests. All the methodology is on there. So I actually love this because this seems more real than like you see charts where this bit is cut off and K6 is the best. But what's interesting is JMeter and Gatling, Java-based tools. I know that Gatling also uses Scala, but it is still based on Java. But they are significantly more resource hungry than other
Yeah.
tools. That's a problem if you're talking about the million scale.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, just go back here. So, what do you think when people come to you? Do you have to convince them to do continuous performance testing, or do they already have that idea in mind and you show them how to do it?
I wish they would come asking for help with continuous performance testing. Typically, we've got this system. We realized that we need to performance test it, and we didn't put that in our plan, or we already have issues. Can you help us run some tests so we can investigate those issues? But so I just start talking to them about what the process could have been, right, and what maybe they can start moving to in the future in terms of understanding performance throughout their delivery process versus this kind of either someone had a check the box task at the end of their release cycle that they had to run a performance test, or they start getting nervous, or already that they don't have one, or that they've already got some issues that they have to look into. But definitely thinking about this ahead of time and building it into the way you develop software is going to be a much smoother approach than trying to kind of fit it in after the fact. And it becomes a cultural thing as well. Like I said, the organizations aren't used, or delivery teams typically aren't used to seeing this data. But if they're the ones from the beginning helping to build the processes and bring in the technology around that, it becomes part of the way they deliver software versus someone else trying to kind of shove it in after the fact.
Yeah. So when you've seen companies do this successfully, when they're actually at that point where they're doing continuous performance testing, what are some things that they do that the ones that didn't get there have done?
Start small, first of all, and with a focus on continuously improving and making this effort actually part of their some organizations call it their technical backlog. So not their backlog for the app they're building, but the backlog that kind of drives the way they build software. Because if this is off the books work, right? Yeah, we'll get to it
Hmm.
someday, or it's someone's job to research. It'll never get done. So making that part
Yeah.
of the way that they work, certainly, and starting small and being willing to change, right? Don't just march down a path and don't stop till you get where you initially thought you were going. But be willing to evaluate what's working, what's not working, and adjust accordingly.
So what's the first concrete step that you would suggest that a company take?
Probably at the component level, and this is easier said than done in more of a microservice architecture versus a monolithic architecture. But identify critical components that you can start running
Hmm.
some small tests on as part of your integration process, a part of your build process, and start getting that data back. Start trending that. Have the organization start to see that value, and then expand from there. That's typically where I see organizations start.
I think that's why I'm not entirely sold on the future of testing tools being browser based, because that's really still just addressing the end
Yes.
of the cycle, right? When it's already you're already able to access it on a browser. So what happens if it's not even integrated yet? You should
Yep.
there's still tests that you can do at that level.
Absolutely. And that's part of the problem with trying to force that traditional approach where all you've done is test the end product into that. Well, yeah, this may be a new component you're building. It's not integrated yet. It doesn't have a UI, but we can still access it, right? We can still put it under some type of load, and you just got to take yourself out of that traditional mindset. And yeah, there's only one way that I know how to create a test.
Yeah. I think, yeah, doing it at the component or unit level is definitely a good start. And already that can be daunting as well, because if you're talking about unit tests, in most teams, that's not a tester that's doing it. In most teams,
Yep.
that would be a developer. So there's also an element of educating developers if they're not already doing that, and talking to them about best practices for testing.
Yeah, I agree. In some of the organizations that we help transition from the performance testing center of excellence to more of a continuous performance test, the resources from that center of excellence were essentially distributed out into the delivery teams. But it was a two-way learning curve, because the performance testers had to get out of that mindset, um, but at the same time help the delivery teams understand, well, how do I think about performance testing? It's just not a unit test. And a big part of that was, as the work is being planned, to start thinking about performance factors uh, ahead of time, or up front, as opposed to at the end. And now we're sitting around, well, what are our objectives here? What are our SLAs? And I found that very few organizations are thinking about performance related factors early on. And it doesn't have to be detailed acceptance criteria, but thinking about, hey, I'm building this component. What type of performance factors might factor into this?
I want to take the opportunity to also show off a new feature.
Awesome.
Because I was surprised as well. There's this thresholds list now. So you've been able to do thresholds in K6 OSS, so the free tool, and on cloud for a while. But now there's also a screen that goes through all of your tests, and you just are able to see it in one screen. And I think, and I really love this because you were talking about SLAs, and it has different names, right? It's SLAs, SLOs,
Yep.
thresholds, checks, they're requirements.
Yep.
Essentially, they're just your objectives quantified, not just, I want it to be faster, but like, no, I want, you know, the the error rate to be less than 3% in this case,
Yep.
or this is about response time. And when you see it in terms over time, if you're running continuously, then you start to pick up on patterns, like certain
Yep.
tests always fail, or they always fail on a certain day or at a certain time. Those things are not things that your big 1,000 user test is normally going to pick up on, because you're not running that every hour or
No.
every commit
A-
even, or every
Absolutely.
release.
Yep. Absolutely. That's another big issue with that type of testing, right? It's this big event. It's typically a one-time event if you look at a relatively small period of time, um, and there's a lot you can miss, or there's some data that you can get that has nothing to do with the application under test. Maybe something was running on a server you had no idea about, and impacted your results. So absolutely, trending over time at a smaller level just gives you so much more valuable information. I'm not saying there's not room for the traditional, big bang system level performance test as the application gets built and released at a much more mature level. Absolutely, but we shouldn't let that be the first indication of performance of that system.
It's almost like I feel like we're seeing a bit of a yo-yo on that front, because in the traditional way was always, you should only ever run a test in test environments, never in production. And then for a while it was you should always run it in production because that then you don't have to simulate load, and it's all about being agile and releasing frequently. And now it's almost like I want to say, well, don't forget to also test before you release, because there's so many other phases and so many ways that you can test it without necessarily requiring a full-blown production environment or even a production like environment.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it has to be a continuum. Very interesting though that you mentioned the testing and production. It totally was a yo-yo. Back when I first started performance testing, it was completely taboo. You don't do anything in
Yeah.
production. And then the more I would say the more modern or liberal organizations would they embrace that. But if you were regulated, or certainly the old kind of conservative type businesses that had ran their businesses on these out of these large IT shops, you couldn't touch production. And now it's it's pretty ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's funny how everything goes back. It's like monoliths to microservices, and now there's some companies who are saying, well, actually, we're going back to monoliths.
Yeah,
And it
it's
makes
big
me
pendulum
think
swings.
it makes me think of Conway's Law again, and how we were saying, the structure of the application, or in this case, a testing tool stack, mirrors subconsciously the structure of the team. I wonder if as people start testing continuously, as performance becomes an activity that's done throughout the entire process, that I wonder if that's going to have an effect on the roles. Because if testing is done by everybody and everyone's a tester, then that's adding a lot more responsibilities to all the other roles.
It is. I think in some of the larger organizations that I work with that have implemented this, they have a role of performance owner. It's not the sole performance tester. It's not the person solely responsible for performance testing, but their role is to kind of clear the way and support the other roles in what they need to do to make continuous performance testing happen. Because you're right, you can't just kind of wave your magic wand and say, okay, developers, you're going to now be running these component level performance tests. There's a lot of work that goes into that to set up the infrastructure and the plumbing to make that happen, and understand what results are, et cetera. So I have seen some of the larger organizations be very successful with that performance owner role. Again, not the kind of one-stop shop for performance testing, but someone that is really the supporter of continuous performance testing.
So we still have a few minutes here, but we should probably wrap it up and let people get to their weekends. Is there
Okay.
anything that you want to plug before we end?
Just excited for my talk at TestCon, and yours as well, by the way. Very interested to see that. From Utopia Solutions standpoint, we're always here to help anyone who wants to learn more about how they can incorporate these practices, specifically around performance testing and test automation into their delivery cycles. So, but thank
So
you, Nicole, for having me, and of course, thank you to K6 as well.
I also posted the link to Utopia Solutions in the chat. Check them out. And also, because I forgot it last time, we're hiring. We want good people. We have a bunch of job openings with K6 and with Grafana. If there's nothing in K6 that fits your needs, we are looking for good people, honestly. We want people that we can work with first, and then we'll talk about the skills. So if you think you might
Awesome.
fit into our culture, we want to hear from you. And I think that's about it for me. I did post links to the speaker page for from me and my normal co-host, Simon Aronson. The three of us are speaking at this one conference about different things. And so that's definitely worth checking out. It's going to be completely virtual, which I'm a little sad about, honestly.
Definitely.
But I guess it's going to at least be easier to access for most. Though
Absolutely.
Lithuania would have been an awesome place to go.
I agree.
All right. Well, Lee,
Uh,
you can stay on, but thank you everybody for watching. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.